Hello, everyone. Megan here from Romance by the Book with the lovely Marielle.
Hello.
And we have a special guest this week, Meg from Plot Trysts, which is an awesome
Hi.
podcast where they
Yeah.
talk about romance and the things that they liked and didn't like about it, but don't go too deep into the plot. It's just like a little amuse-bouche about whether or not you should read a book.
Yeah, that's basically it. So,
Thank you so much for being here.
yeah, thanks for
We're
having
gonna have
me.
three totally kind of different perspectives, I think. So I'm really excited to chat about this book, which it was my pick because I read it and I thought it was like an old book. I don't know why in my head I was like, this is an old school romance. And then I looked and it was not that old.
Not
Not
that
that
old.
old at all. Like 2018 or something. Um, but there were some things about it that read old to me, and I did
Mhm.
want to talk to you guys and see what you thought. And part of that, I guess, will since it starts from the very prologue, was this like multi POV situation that we had, where we like would go into anybody's head that was around, and it happened from the very beginning of the book. I'm curious, first of all, what you guys thought of it, and then also what you think the author was trying to achieve with that, and whether it was successful or not. What do you think?
I would say at first I was a little bit thrown by how many different perspectives we were getting. But once I got into the groove, it worked fine for me as far as reading. I kind of liked knowing like it's sort of this same feel as like the old school third person omniscient, like, but you get it through so many more perspectives, which I thought was really fun. Um and in the reading of it, that didn't bother me at all. I think we did discuss in the recapping, it was a little bit difficult because we'd be going on a tangent about like Charlie and Berg, and then it would have a cut in with the sisters. And so note taking and talking about it was more difficult because of that. But in the reading of it, it didn't bother me at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't say it bothered me as I was reading it. Like I was able to follow whose perspective it was, and that didn't bother me. I will say, as we got further on and more and more and more perspectives were added, it's like sometimes people you hadn't even met yet, they'd be like, these killers for hire, all of a sudden you're in their heads and you've never
Right.
heard them before. Unless maybe you'd read some other books. I was kind of assuming maybe they had been like previous protagonists. That threw me a little because I wasn't sure like when they would show up, if they would show up, and I was really confused even if they did show up, like was that the person I was reading from or not? So I'll say like after the halfway mark, I think I would have liked it to be more consistent about which perspective we were in.
Okay.
I thought for me, I thought that it kept the pacing fast, which seems counterintuitive to me. Like I feel like the more heads you're in, it would like slow things down. But like you didn't have to wait until like the main characters figured stuff out because you like were already in everybody's head. You already knew. And sometimes you would go to like across the world on a plane over Italy and you're like, oh, okay. Um, so it was, yeah, I don't know. It didn't bug me. I felt, but it felt, and I think that's the thing that made it feel super old school to me is because I was like, oh, a modern editor would never allow this to happen
Right.
in a romance novel. And here we are. Um, I did think it was unusual because normally the people's heads that we're in are only like the very main characters and the ones that we need to know what their feelings are and
Right.
what's going on. And this wasn't really the case here. Like sometimes we were in people's head that they like never showed back up again. And you were just like, oh, okay.
Well, and a lot of the ones, like especially the ones from like the bad guys' point of view or whatever, I felt like were useful because our main characters wouldn't have known that info, at least not at that point, if we hadn't had that. But um on the flip side, I don't know if that info was necessary at that time. Like we could have found it out at the same time the characters did, like after their investigation or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And I wasn't sure if like if it would have harmed the story at all to just not have that POV.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wonder if it would have just changed the feel of the story versus, yeah, like if it would,
Like
if it
narrowed
took,
it down some.
yeah, or if it made it more, if it would have made it more tense or more like mysterious,
Right.
certain things. But and I don't know if I would have, I mean, that book has not been written, so I don't know if I would have
Right.
liked that better even. But I wonder if that's what she was doing, was trying to just like make it so you didn't have to like think too hard about the parts that the characters didn't know because you were in on it from
Right.
before.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess it's true, the parts like from the villain's perspective, a lot of times they would come in when not much was going on with the main characters, like they were just setting up their house or taking a car ride or something like that. So
Yeah.
I agree with you that it kept the pace like really quick.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's kind of a long book, like it was longer than I felt, and I think that
It,
might have been.
it was long, yeah. It was longer than I thought when I opened it up.
um well, speaking of the, kind of that, do you think that the balance between the action and the romance and like the little mystery bits that were in there was good, or did you feel like it leaned more one towards than the other? I know Megan was like, kiss already.
I did message Marielle at 60%, and I was like, hi, this is me. They still haven't kissed. What's happening right now?
I
And
have to
thankfully, like
agree with
3%
Megan.
later, they finally did kiss. But I was like, oh, it's pushing it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Megan, because I also was like, is this a romance? Like, they're not spending much time together. like they're attracted to each other, sure, but anyway. So
Yeah.
I do think it detracted a little from the romance.
Yeah, I felt like I mean, I had a lot of fun with like the family dynamics that were going on in there,
Mhm.
but it was interesting to me that, he was clearly like, "Oh, maybe we could like go out sometime," and she shot him down like immediately. And it took a very long time for them to revisit that.
Well, and I
So,
think she did a good job, the author, of making clear that Charlie really did like him, which is why she didn't want anything to do with him, because she thinks of herself as like being cursed and she didn't want to like drag him down with her. Um, and I thought that that was really good. That as the reader, just like from her head, but then Berg gets to know it from the sisters, which of course made for a really funny scene, but also really helpful as far as letting him know that, like, yes, she shot you down, but like she really does like you. Like if you just stray dog it and hang around, then probably she'll change her mind. And he's kind of like, doesn't love the idea, but also he can't help but want to help her, which means he is sticking around anyway. So it all just kind of worked out the way that the sisters said it would.
I did feel like he in under any other circumstances, he probably would have been like, "Okay, well, bye then." That
Yeah.
would have been the end of it
Hmm.
Well,
because he
and their
was pretty
proximity
respectful.
too, because she was right across the street. It's not like he was like, "Oh, well, I guess we're never going to see each other again." It was like she was going to be there at least for the foreseeable future. So, they were going to keep having run-ins, even if he hadn't like fully involved himself in the situation, which he did.
Yeah,
But,
they're helpful.
um, I think that when it comes to the world building, I know we wanted to talk about that a little bit. Very unique creatures in this one versus a lot of other, and I've read a lot of paranormal over my time, and there's always been a lot of creatures, but some of these were new to me and I thought that was really fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed. I mean, I think the reason why I even picked up the book was because it was honey badgers, and I was like, "What now?"
Yeah.
Um, and then also, I don't think I've ever read a book where they had like mixed breeds
Hybrid creatures.
and
Yeah.
who like didn't. It wasn't like, oh, I was thinking those people have like babies and like these three look like the mom and these two look like the dad. These
Right.
these ones were like
Fully mixed
mishmash.
up. Yeah.
and it meant different things for like the way that they like Charlie doesn't shift at all,
Mm-hmm.
except for like her claws and her teeth. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then their other sister, when she shifts, it's like a whole
She's like a
thing.
giant.
So I thought that was interesting
Mm-hmm.
and kind of unique. You said you'd read another book from a different series of this.
Yes. So when I first started getting into PNR, after I like got back into romance, like in my, I don't know, like probably 15 years ago, um, there was an earlier series, I think it was just called the Pack series, which had a lot of creatures in itself as well. There was like lions and wolves and other cat shifters, and the Smith Pack was a main part of that series, and that's you see some of those characters here, like inside roles. Um, but yeah, so I recognize some of those names, and a lot of them are very like Southern country bumpkin names, like Deanne
Yeah.
and Missy Sue or Missy, I forget what it is, but yeah, there's a lot of like, I'm from Georgia, so I'm like, yes, I recognize that that is like a very Southern, like, you know, style of name, and it's kind of funny because a lot of the women characters, especially, have these names, but like also you don't fuck with them. Like they're dangerous. They will gut you. Like you don't mess around with them. They are not to be toyed with about their names or anything else. And I think that carried through here in this book as well with Charlie and Stevie and Max. Like they might look unassuming, but don't make that mistake.
I thought too, I guess since we're talking about this, that they within their family, like Max especially teases Stevie, and they've got like they have conversations about like the way that Stevie uses like mental like rehab facilities and stuff. And in the beginning, I think when I started the reread, I was kind of like, oh, this is like some of the language that they used and some of like the way that they talked about her issues was like I thought like, wow, I don't know that this would fly. Like even which might be another reason why I thought it was an old book. And then
Mhm.
I'm like, oh, that wasn't that long ago. But even between then and now, I feel like it would have been like that. The way that they described those things would not have like I don't know. It felt icky to me
Yeah.
on the reread, and it was mostly in the first like did you say like 2 or 3 chapters?
Yeah, it was very early on. And uh I think the language around it softened a little bit more like throughout the book. And they didn't it was more like they discussed her using them as like a spa getaway versus like actually needing to be there for like the mental health services, and they didn't
But
reference
except
it
that
as
she really
much.
did need mental help. Like she was
Well,
on
yeah.
medication and she really didn't need and it wasn't just her that needed like mental health help.
Yeah.
But the way that they discuss like I thought that was interesting because it's not even that old of a book
Mhm.
that I wouldn't have expected it to be so like I don't know. It was a little cringy to me.
Yeah, I mean, I also felt the part where she goes off of her meds so that she can like access these superpowers was a little I mean, you could read it in a very problematic way, right?
Mhm.
Hmm.
Like she really wanted to be on her meds and like be under control, but then also she goes off of them and suddenly she's this amazing creature. I don't know. I felt some kind of way about it. I don't know
Mhm.
what kind of way that was, but I was like, I don't know if I like this.
Same. I think we might have briefly chatted about that a little in the recap, just the fact that it was a little bit hinky, the whole like
Hmm.
she has to go off her meds to like Hulk out on the bad guys or whatever.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. The way that they like, I mean, I think the author did a decent job of kind of showing like physical, I don't know, physical changes, but yeah, changes to like just the way she spoke and how fast, and things that just how she was interacting with people. And then she's like, "Oh yeah, I'm off my meds, but just for a day." Um, but it did feel, I don't know. I didn't love that was like the way that they almost like the way that they allow her to access her um her her true, I don't know if it's her true self, but it's like
Yeah.
that part of herself couldn't be
Right.
accessed if she's on her meds, and I thought that was weird.
Yeah.
They didn't explain it that way either. It wasn't as if they said like, "Oh, the medication blocks her from whatever."
Right.
They just took her off her meds and made her have like a full like huge panic attack
Which is
basically,
what
and that's
caused
what
the
yeah.
transformation. Yeah.
Which I was like, "Oh, that feels not great."
Yeah, exactly.
But these people don't like deal with stuff in a healthy way generally.
I mean, yeah, that's also true.
Yeah. Well, I think we talked about this a little bit too, Marielle, but like you mentioned, Stevie's the one that's clearly had the most like therapy and is the most in touch with her feelings about things, and is the most medicated. So she probably has a lot um stronger sense of her own psychological problems more than most people would. And so she recognizes some of that stuff in her sisters too, and of course, they don't really like when she points it out. But I felt like that dynamic, because she's the youngest, I felt like that gave her a little bit, um, more power in this, like, sister dynamic, the fact that she was more cognizant of the trauma that they all have had and the issues that arose from that. Um, but of course, she's also, like, a genius, so she had that going for her too. I am science.
Mhm.
I did find it interesting that Shelly Laurenston like didn't seem to worry very much about making them likable,
Mhm.
and that like all of them had a thing that was just like, "Oh wow, that's terrible."
That's a
Like
lot.
Charlie, he just wanted to like when they found out that their father was not dead, and Charlie just got super angry about it, and Berg is
Was,
like,
like,
"Oh."
throwing bodies around the morgue, and
Mhm.
the cop is like, "Yeah, you can't do that."
It like they I think a lot of times they played it for like laughs, but
Mhm.
it was also not like it wasn't like heroic behavior.
Right.
Um and then Max also, and Stevie's like super, she has a very big ego for somebody, but I did think it was interesting that she's so unsure and scared of like people and other,
And bears.
certain situations. Yeah. And even herself.
Yeah.
Like any but she's very sure about her like smarts and her talents, and I thought that was an interesting, maybe realistic, just a kind of juxtaposition,
Mhm.
Mhm.
um and one that I do feel is kind of, I want to say brave, but like people don't always feel comfortable letting it all kind of hang out like that, like to
Right.
have somebody who's like, "Oh, I want to kill my father." You're like, "Oh, okay, okay."
Yeah. And I mean, I haven't read any of the other books, so I didn't know if this was a difference between them being like honey badgers, 'cause the whole thing with honey badgers just they don't care, they let it all hang out, like
Yep.
that's an aspect of that. I wasn't sure just because I'm not familiar with how else she writes them.
I think that was a big thing, and I think um they do point it out a little bit in so
Mhm.
far as, especially with Max, because she's all honey badger, and like her family, like her cousin that she gets in a fight with when they go to the safe house and all that. Like, I feel like that is definitely like the honey badger rage. And they say that too about the twin ants that are like after them.
Mhm.
That's like they have that honey badger rage and they don't even know it. Like they thought they were human, but like it's still like coming through. And so I think that that had a lot to do with how these characters were drawn up. Um in comparison. Now I will say the wolf pack, the Smith pack in the earlier books have similar like anger issues and stuff like that. So I think that she just likes exploring that type of personality, which is
Sure.
interesting.
Well, and I think it's especially interesting for female characters, right? Because
Mhm.
they're
Yeah.
not allowed to, in many books,
Right.
show that rage, right? Or in
Mhm.
real life, let's be honest.
Yeah. Mhm.
I agree, and I do. I'm so weird about this. I liked it that the female characters were allowed to be like angry and just look. But I'm like, I'm not 100% sure how I feel about it being like the female characters are like ragey and brr, and then the male characters are all like, let's talk calmly. I'm like, like at least we had the hockey player guy who didn't care about anything except if somebody who could be part of his
Can you
team.
skate? That guy was hilarious. And I assume he must be in like an earlier book too. Like him and his wife clearly met like in an earlier book, but I haven't read that book. But
I never thought
he's
either.
clearly an interesting type of character. And I think, is it Berg or his brother maybe who
Guy.
say something about him as far as like, other than his wife who tolerates him, like literally nobody likes him. Like
Mhm.
he's like so messy. Like everybody's like, you're so weird, dude. Like you don't, like the feelings are just like not there. Like even the wife is like, I'm the mother of your children. She almost killed me and you want her on your hockey team? Like what's wrong with you? And so yeah, I think that would be an interesting hero for a book for sure. I
Mhm.
might have to look into that one just out of curiosity.
Yeah. Did we think that like time and place in this book was like, I'm not sure that I always knew how much, like, I feel like time passed and then it was stretched and compressed a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But also because of the head hopping, we would go from like we would travel
Right.
big spans of spaces. I think we started out in Europe and then went to New York, and then we were like in New Jersey, Long Island, somewhere.
Well, no, they were in
But
Queens, I think.
the ants
Yeah.
were then, but there was like parts that were in Scotland and parts that were like
Mhm.
Italy, and
Yeah.
so it felt like the whole world, but there wasn't, like we hopped here, there, and everywhere. Even though the story was really about this like one family and how insular they were and how hard it was for them to like trust anybody or add anybody to their like family.
Mhm.
That was interesting to me how like how all over the how all over the globe we were.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess that's the like I guess the this like action adventure suspense the portion of things probably that allowed for that
Mhm.
versus a straight romance where I feel like you're usually like you're there with those characters
Mm-hmm.
with the main love interests and you kind of stay there. I feel like in this we didn't really. We spent a lot of time with other people and in other places and all over, which was interesting to me for a romance. Um, and then also shifters and humans didn't seem to really overlap very much, almost as if the humans didn't know about the shifters at all.
Mm-hmm.
Did you think that was like? Did you like that choice? Because even like there was
The humans
the
not knowing about the shifters, you mean?
yeah.
I think it's a pretty consistent choice as far as paranormal goes in general, for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Humans don't know about the things that go bump in the night. And a lot of times one of the main characters even is human who's finding out all these things that are happening, and it's like opening up the whole wider world to them, which is an interesting way of going about it. Whereas this one, of course, everybody involved was a creature of their own. So they all already knew the broad strokes, at least. You did know that the sisters knew a lot less about like shifter culture than anyone else because of how they were raised, and that they lost their mom young, and that they didn't get raised in a pack with other shifters who were like them, and so they didn't know a lot about, like when Charlie gets shot and the doctor's like, oh, you're gonna get a fever and this, and she's like, yeah, no, that doesn't happen, and the doctor's like, yeah, okay, like she doesn't, like she has a whole different way of healing and doesn't know anything about like what's the like normal like shifter way of things, which I thought was interesting too. I think that was sort of a way of doing the same kind of thing. Like she wasn't human, she was a creature, but she doesn't necessarily know about all the other creatures. She only knows about herself and her sisters and like what they can do. And so I guess it had the same kind of vibe.
Yeah. Well, I guess because they were different, then they had to stick together, and they felt they had a bit of an isolation to it. But their cousin was marrying a human.
Right.
And I thought, like,
a very rich
wow.
one.
Yeah. And it was very important to them that he like not figure out what was going on. But so much stuff happened at the wedding. I was like, how are you keeping?
How is it possible that you kept it a secret? Yeah.
I know.
That was, and that played for laughs a lot too. And that's another thing I kind of wrote a note about, was like, there were so many parts where I really laughed out loud at this book, which rom-coms are not always my favorite, especially here lately, these like trade paperback ones where I feel like so many of them are like not actually funny. Like or they have like a couple funny moments, but that's it. Like they're not, then they drop some like, you know, somebody's dad has cancer or some other thing, and I'm like, this is not funny, you know what I mean? But like this book was funny, and I almost felt like it was old school in that way too. Like that's not like a thing that I feel like is as common these days. Like when you call it a rom-com, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be funny, but this book was hilarious. And I was curious if either of you felt anything about that.
I did think it was funny. I think one of the hard things for me about paranormal romance is how much violence is played for laughs. Like in the very beginning, Stevie like puts like a what's the word for it? It's a shot,
The syringe.
like
Yeah.
a syringe. Thank you. Into some like a human's eye. And I was like, oh my God. But they were like, well, she didn't die. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, what is this book? And then I realized, okay, they're just gonna be beating other people up and it's gonna be funny. So that's something that's can be tough for me. I think once I got into the swing of things, I was like, okay, if they're not actually killing each other and they're gonna heal really quickly, I guess I can get on board with it. But that's something that can be a little tough for me about paranormal in general. I didn't think the book was funny though.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was really funny. I think that's one of the things that I enjoyed about this book when I first read it, was that it was like there was so much going on, but and there were things going on that like could have been sad or like, you know, deeply hurtful to them, but the main characters in this were so like, yeah, it's like they blew those things off or laughed at them. And it just like made it so you couldn't like dwell on the stuff that might have been like, wow, they have a terrible dad, but wow,
like it's so bad that it's funny. That's another thing I think she did well, is that like the dad, like so many of the things that he's done and said that they were thinking about from the past and that you saw yourself in the book are honestly horrifying. But like the way that they react to it, because they're so used to his shenanigans, it's funny, because it's kind of like if you don't, you know, you have to laugh so you don't cry kind of thing. It's like that's kind of what it felt like sometimes. It was just so absurd how horrible he was that like it was funny.
Yeah, but it almost made me think of people in real life who grow up with like a terrible family and they just don't realize how bad it is until they're like talking to somebody else and like, haha, when I was a kid and my mom used to, and people are like,
right, and you're like
horrified and they're like, what?
Yeah.
That's not funny? Oh, oops.
Yeah.
And I felt like Yeah, I feel like it was kind of played that way. And then you
Yeah.
had Berg to be like, what's going on now?
Yeah. I feel like there was a little bit of that, but I do think they knew that he was horrible.
Oh, yeah.
Like they weren't surprised. And in fact, I think sometimes they'd be like, "Oh yeah, he's bad, but you think that was bad? Like it's even worse than you think."
Right.
And they'd come out with something else, and you'd be like, "Oh my god."
Oh, well, and the whole scene
It's
where
not as bad as the
Britta, the
time he
sister,
sold me to, like,
Yes.
Britta's like, I mean, I know you say your dad's bad, but like, how bad could he possibly be? And they're like, well,
Mm-hmm.
he once sold Max into indentured servitude or whatever. It's like it's like beyond the pale of what you would
Yes.
consider like a bad dad
mhm.
especially in romance. And so it's just like it's to the point of absurd, which makes you laugh at it. But
Absolutely.
Yeah.
um and
But
that
then
kind
it
of plays
also
in.
makes you
Sorry.
understand why they, like, do not engage with other people.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
they only trust each other.
Mhm.
And it did make it, like, extra special when they started trusting their little bear neighbors.
Mhm. Well, and that kind of leads to my last topic, which is like toxic family versus found family and
Mhm.
how that can play into different aspects of life. And it's interesting too, because for them, they are all blood related, the sisters, and they love each other, but everybody else in their family, they're like, no. And then for good reason for them. And a lot of their family says no to them too, because of their dad. And so then them finding this, like their family being totally unexpected, but also ends up being really meaningful because how hard of a time they've had, like letting anyone else into their life.
Yeah. I mean, and it wasn't even just the Duns. Like, I mean, it was them especially,
Yeah.
but it felt like the whole neighborhood um somewhat adopted them, even though when they first came in, it was like, ooh,
You're a honey
Kenny.
badger. You can't be here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Max like eating from their beehives, and like it was just like immediately she was doing what she wasn't supposed to do or whatever.
Right.
Um, but then they're having like a neighborhood block party and like hanging out by the pool together and and um it was sweet to see them evolve from like this will be a business transaction. We will only stay here for the shortest amount of time possible. To like actually they're part of the neighborhood, and that people in the neighborhood, was it when their dad somebody like was in their house,
It was the dad.
and
Yeah.
the neighbors were like, yeah, there's somebody in there. They covered themselves in like
Bear spray.
bear
Bear spray.
spray.
Yeah. It's interesting, Marielle, because you said this book feels old school in a lot of ways. I feel like this is the way where it feels more like in touch with the times, right? This
Mhm.
found family versus toxic family of origin.
Mhm.
And I think especially interesting for paranormal, because in paranormal, there's so much like, this is my pack, and like, this is my family, and you can join my
Right.
pack, right? And they're all related.
Mhm.
But instead, they're really creating their own. And I did like that a lot.
Yeah. I also I think the fact that they were like of mixed ancestry, I guess. Um and that the way that that manifested, where they didn't really fit in
To
with
either side.
any of the normal, like, the normal pack divisions didn't really apply to them,
Hmm.
was interesting to me. Um, because even though within the world they had like this is the group of wolves, and these are the group these are the bears, and and we have our own like system and their own like group that protects each other and whatever, but they didn't fit into any of that. And so they ended up, instead of, well, in the beginning they're secluded, like they're just them, but by the end they kind of have their loyalty, like they don't have to have loyalties with anyone because everybody has a vested interest in helping them, which
Mhm.
is
Yeah.
was interesting to me.
Yeah, I liked it a lot. I liked that part. Like everyone's interested in helping them, and
Mhm.
also everyone likes them. Like they had the block party, and it wasn't just the bears. The wolves were there, and the panda bear was there, and all that
Hmm.
stuff. So
Right.
I did like that part. Hmm.
Yeah, that was sweet.
I did think it was interesting, point of comic relief too, the kid genius who was like friends with Stevie, and the whole thing with his family and how she had like total face blindness when it came to like all of them except for him. Like that was definitely played for laughs. And I thought that was and also with Stevie showing her like let's say less appealing side as a heroine, as like a future heroine, like her book is next, but just like the whole like, oh, you're not important enough for me to remember kind of is like, and then she's like, oh, it's not personal, and they're like, I mean, it feels pretty personal to me.
She's like, it's not personal. You're just not special or interesting.
Yeah.
Like you, for my brain has to be focused on only the most important things. You're not one of those.
Yeah,
I was
it
like,
was but that was really funny because it, and even there, like the people who she's saying it to, at first they're offended, and then it's like you would just have to laugh because it's so crazy. Like, of course, like this genius person, like you're not important enough for her to remember. Fine, okay. Like,
well, and she meets. There's a couple. I guess it's that one guy's sister. She meets 2 or 3 times and never remembers. And then one time she's like, "Oh, you're his assistant," and she's like,
I'm his sister.
"I am his sister."
Yeah.
Yeah, and the one she probably had the most contact with, being Coop, the musician, is the one she never ever remembers. And it's always like, "Do you want my autograph?" And it was, I mean, it's absurd, but it was so funny. And that um I also liked how she later on, like it's played for laughs, but at one point later on she does say like, I understand him. Like he's driving his family crazy. They're driving him crazy. He needs a place where he can just be himself with his big old brain, and like I can do that for him, and so I want to do that for him. And obviously her experience of, you know, not having anybody else in her family that is as smart as her, and what kind of issues that's brought up in her life. I thought it was an interesting way for her to like exercise that.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, she is a side character. I mean, I feel like this book was as much about them
The
as
sisters.
sisters,
Hmm.
as it was about the like romance between Charlie and Berg, and maybe
Hmm.
even more so.
Mm.
Um, but I thought that was a really like it was interesting to see how different they are from each other, how much they sometimes don't understand each other at all,
Hmm.
but still they um work, like they work together, and they like stick together
Hmm.
even when they're like at each other's throat, because that was
Right, when
most
they're infighting, they're still us against them with everybody
Right.
else. Yeah. Oh, this was a fun, interesting one. Definitely a different pick from a lot of the ones we've had. So thanks for that, Marielle. Excellent work on the throwback pick.
thanks. I'm
So
glad you enjoyed it, even though it was
it was fun.
a bear to to try to talk about. Yeah, it wasn't
Thank
until I started rereading I was like, oh, whoops.
Well, thank you
It
for
was fun.
inviting me to read it too. It definitely took me out of my comfort zone, but it was, I mean, it wasn't like difficult read or anything like that. It wasn't like upset reading it, you know?
Yeah.
Good, I'm glad. It was, yeah, I'm glad that we had, um, I'm glad that we got different perspectives on. I know Megan had not read this book, but she had read other books, um, by
By
Shelly
the author.
Laurenston.
Hmm.
I have read this series, but I hadn't read anything outside of this. And then Meg, you hadn't read it before at all. So it was nice to kind of be able to talk about it from different perspectives, and just because I didn't know anything about the Smith pack or the other
Right.
the other people. I didn't know, so it was interesting to
Well, and
be
she
able
did a
to
good
talk
job,
about
I think, of giving you the impression of what the Smith pack means and like who they are in the wider world of shifters, even if you hadn't like
it.
read that before.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, that's true. I didn't feel like I felt like there must be more story there, but I didn't feel like I needed more story to understand
Yeah,
what was happening in this book,
yeah, agreed.
which is good because this book was already like there was a lot going on.
yeah. So if you liked this book and you want to read on, there's 3 more books in the series that are
Mhm.
currently out. 2 of them are about the sisters, obviously, and then there's one other one after that. So yeah, this was a fun one. Thanks, everyone. Good to
Thanks.
see you
Thanks.
all, and everyone out there. We will see you for November.
Then.
Bye.